What would you do if you were told you didn't belong in the very seat you paid for? What if the reason wasn't on your ticket, but written on your skin? On a quiet morning. Adrian Cole, a calm yet powerful Black CEO, stepped onto Flight 482, expecting nothing more than a routine trip from Chicago to New York. His seat, 1A in first class, was confirmed, paid for, and waiting, or so he thought. Within minutes, that seat was taken from him, not because of a mistake, not because of an emergency, but because someone in authority decided, without a second thought, that he didn't belong there. What followed would shake an entire airline and ripple across an entire industry. But how did one man's humiliation turn into a national reckoning? What was caught on video that the airline never wanted the world to see? And how could a single letter ignite reforms reaching far beyond the runway? Stay with us. This isn't just a story about flying. It's a story about dignity, justice, and the quiet power to change the system. Like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss a single moment of what's about to unfold. The hum of the terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International was a sound Adrian Cole knew by heart. It was the soundtrack of countless departures and arrivals in a career that had taken him to nearly every major city on the map. Even now, at 46, he carried himself through airports with the unhurried confidence of someone who belonged in every room he entered. Today's trip was a red-eye to San Francisco, a flight he had taken more times than he could count. And like so many of those journeys, he was seated in 1A, the first-class aisle seat he preferred for its space, its quiet, and its proximity to the door. He moved with measured steps down the jet bridge, his black leather briefcase in one hand, his phone in the other. Every motion felt deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant. He was the CEO of Novosphere Technologies, a logistics and data solutions firm that had, in just over a decade, grown from a cramped co-working office to a multinational powerhouse. First class was not a luxury for Adrian. It was a necessity. With back-to-back meetings, unpredictable hours, and a spine that still ached from a football injury in college, he valued the small grace of being able to stretch his legs. The cabin greeted him with the faint aroma of fresh coffee and newly vacuumed upholstery. Soft lighting glowed overhead, casting a warm tone across the cream leather seats. The aisle was still clear. He had boarded early, as was his habit. Adrian placed his briefcase in the overhead bin, adjusted it so it sat neatly parallel to the latch, and slid into 1A. The seat cradled him with the kind of familiarity that comes from years of routine. He reached into the side pocket of his carry-on, retrieved his noise-canceling headphones, and laid them gently on his lap. As he adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit jacket, a voice from months earlier echoed in his mind. It was his wife, Rachel, sitting across their kitchen table, her hand cupped around a mug of tea. "Not everyone in those spaces sees you the way you see yourself," she'd said softly. "Sometimes, no matter how high you climb, they'll still want to remind you where they think you belong." He had smiled at the time, assuring her he was used to it. But he had learned not to dismiss those reminders. They had a way of appearing when least expected. A figure moved into his peripheral vision, a woman in her late 40s, crisp navy uniform tailored to precision, hair pulled into a neat chignon streaked with blonde and silver. Her name tag caught the overhead light Melissa Grant, lead flight attendant. She stopped beside his row, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Adrian glanced up, offering the polite nod he extended to every crew member. She didn't return it. Instead, she studied his face for a beat longer than felt casual. Her eyes shifted briefly to the seat placard above him, then back to his face. Her lips pressed together, as if she'd come to a private conclusion. "Sir," she said at last, her voice cool and precise, "you don't belong here." The words landed in the quiet like a dropped coin. Adrian blinked, momentarily unsure if he had heard correctly. He removed one earbud, setting it on the armrest. "Pardon me," he said, his tone calm but edged with curiosity. "This seat," she repeated, tapping the headrest lightly with two manicured fingers, "is for first-class passengers. I'm going to need you to move. For a moment." Adrian didn't respond. Not because he didn't have the words, but because he had learned that silence could be more revealing than speech. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out his phone. The screen lit under his touch, and he opened the Airline's app. There it was, in bold text. Novosphere Technologies, Adrian Cole seat, 1A first class. He angled the phone toward her. "My boarding pass confirms 1A, he said. Voice even. Scanned at the gate without issue. Melissa's eyes did not drop to the screen. They stayed locked on his, a steady blue gaze that neither flinched nor softened. I don't need to see your little phone trick, she said, her tone sharpening. I know who's on my manifest, and you're not listed here. Now, are you going to move, or do I need to involve the captain? The shift in the cabin was immediate. 2 rows ahead, a man in a tailored blazer glanced over his shoulder. Across the aisle, a passenger with sandy hair and a sunburned face smirked openly. He leaned back, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "Bet he printed that ticket at home," he drawled. The chuckle that followed was low and humorless. Adrian turned his head slightly toward the voice, taking in the man's posture. The self-satisfaction etched into his grin. It was Trevor Hayes. Though Adrian didn't yet know the name, he only recognized the type, the kind of man who thrived on small public humiliations. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, that pulse of heat that came when someone tried to shrink him down to their measure. In another life, in another mood, he might have challenged them both right there. But Adrian Cole had spent a lifetime navigating rooms and people who underestimated him. He knew the cost of giving them the reaction they wanted. Instead, he took a slow breath, letting it settle deep in his lungs. With his right hand, he slipped the phone back into his jacket and kept his thumb pressed against the side button until a small red light blinked on the screen. The audio recorder was running now, silent and unobtrusive. Every clipped word, every mocking aside would be captured. "Very well," he said simply, rising from the seat. He reached up, retrieved his briefcase, and stepped into the aisle with deliberate calm. Melissa moved ahead of him, her pace brisk, her back straight. She didn't look back to see if he followed. The eyes of the cabin followed instead. Some passengers turned away quickly, embarrassed. Others watched openly, as if this small theater was a welcome diversion before takeoff. Adrian kept his gaze forward, his stride measured. They passed through business class, then premium economy, the seats narrowing, the air thickening with the scent of recycled ventilation. At last, Melissa stopped at the very rear of the plane. A middle seat awaited between a man already asleep with his mouth open and a boy no older than 10, sketching intently in a spiral notebook. "Here you go," she said, gesturing curtly. "You can sit here." Adrian met her gaze for a long moment, saying nothing. Then he stepped into the row, slid into the cramped seat, and buckled in. Melissa turned and walked away without another word. The boy beside him looked up, pencil still in hand. His eyes were wide, curious, and a little uncertain. Adrian offered him a small, genuine smile. The boy hesitated, then returned it before looking back down at his drawing. Adrian settled back, the hum of the engines just beginning to rise underfoot. He could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing at the edges of his thoughts. This was no simple seating mistake. This was something else, something he had seen before and would not ignore. In the pocket of his mind. The first sentence of a letter began to form. The cabin door was still open, and boarding was still in progress when Adrian pulled his phone from his jacket pocket again. The recording light glowed faintly on the screen. He let the device rest casually on his thigh, the microphone unobstructed. Every word that had been said in first class was already saved. Now, every word that would follow would be, to. The middle seat pressed against his hips in a way that felt almost symbolic. The man to his left shifted in his sleep, muttering under his breath, while the boy on his right continued sketching the airplane outside the window. Adrian glanced at the notebook. The lines were quick but precise, the kind of drawing made by someone who had studied planes long enough to capture their angles from memory. He thought about asking the boy's name, but before he could, movement in the aisle caught his attention. Melissa was coming back toward him. Her expression was tight, her chin slightly raised. She stopped at his row and spoke in a voice pitched just low enough that most nearby passengers wouldn't hear. "I still need you to produce a printed boarding pass," she said. "The manifest is what I go by, and you're not listed." Adrian kept his tone even. "Melissa, my boarding pass was scanned at the gate. I'm in your system." "Sir, I'm not going to argue with you," she replied. "If you want to speak to the captain, I can arrange that. But this is where you'll be seated for the flight." There was no curiosity in her eyes, no trace of a person trying to solve a mistake. She had made up her mind before she even spoke to him in 1A. He could see it now, as clearly as if she had announced it. This was not about a ticket. It was about her perception of who should occupy that seat. He let a pause stretch between them, long enough for her to shift her weight slightly. Then he said, "I'll remain here for now, but I'm making a formal record of this." Melissa's lips pressed together. "You do what you need to do," she said, and walked away. The boy finally glanced up from his sketch. "Was that your seat up there?" he asked softly. Adrian turned toward him, surprised at the directness. It was. The boy looked back at his drawing, his pencil moving again. "My mom says sometimes people make up reasons to move you when they don't like that you're there." Adrian felt something in his chest tighten again, but differently this time. He studied the boy's small hands, the way they gripped the pencil with quiet determination. He thought of Rachel's voice in the kitchen, warning him. He thought of boardrooms where he'd had to prove his credentials twice over, and he thought of how moments like this taught lessons long before they should be learned. He opened the Notes app on his phone. The white screen stared back at him, empty, waiting. He typed the first line deliberately. Each word weighed before it appeared. "This isn't about a seat. It's about being told you don't belong in a place you have every right to be." His thumbs moved faster as the next sentences formed. He documented the flight number, the gate, the exact time he boarded. He described Melissa's refusal to even look at his digital boarding pass, her insistence that he was not on the manifest. He wrote down Trevor Hayes's mocking comment and the way it had been delivered for the cabin to hear. He did not write about anger. He wrote about the cost of being doubted in public, the erosion of dignity when your legitimacy is questioned without cause. He wrote about the silent calculations required in these moments, whether to confront, to comply, to record, or to simply leave. And he wrote about choosing the path that would matter beyond the flight. Around him, the cabin filled. The overhead bins clicked shut. Seatbelts snapped into place. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers and giving the expected flight time. The boy beside him closed his notebook, slipping it into the pocket of the seat in front of him. His eyes were on the window now, watching the ground crew move in practiced patterns. Adrian took a breath, letting the ambient sounds of the cabin sink into the recording. The rustle of safety cards, the muffled voices of passengers settling in, the clink of drink glasses in first class. He wanted every element of the scene preserved. It wasn't just about words. It was about the atmosphere, the unspoken tension that lingered in the air. The safety demonstration began. Lena Zhao moving gracefully down the aisle to check belts and bags. When she reached Adrian's row, she offered him a small, almost imperceptible nod. He returned it. It was the kind of nod that said, "I saw what happened." It was not approval, not complicity, just acknowledgement. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Adrian saved the audio file, labeling it with the date and flight number. He slid the phone into his pocket again and rested his hands on his knees. The vibration underfoot grew as the engines powered up. The boy spoke again, almost a whisper. "Do you fly a lot?" Adrian smiled faintly. "More than I'd like to." The boy nodded as if that made sense. "I've never been in first class," he said. Adrian looked at him for a moment before replying. "You will be," he said. "One day." The boy gave a small smile, but his eyes drifted back to the window. Adrian wondered if he believed it. He wondered how many quiet encounters like this would shape the boy's expectations of the world. The plane lifted into the night sky, Atlanta's lights spreading out below like a web of gold. Adrian leaned back, the seat narrower than his shoulders. He felt the edge of the briefcase pressing against his leg, a reminder of the work he still had ahead. Somewhere in that case was a presentation for the San Francisco meeting, but right now, the real work was beginning here, 30,000 feet above the ground. He reopened his notes. The cursor blinked patiently. He began to shape his account into something more than a log. He chose words with precision, layering fact and feeling until they formed a narrative that could not be dismissed as overreaction. He wrote not just for himself, but for anyone who had been told, without cause, that they didn't belong. As the cabin settled into the low murmur of flight, Adrian kept writing. He described the way Melissa's voice had sharpened, the way Trevor Hayes's laughter had carried. He described the walk down the aisle, each row like a rung on a ladder in reverse. And he described the boy beside him, head tilted toward the glass, perhaps already filing the scene away in his memory. By the time the fasten seatbelt sign chimed off, Adrian had the bones of something powerful. He knew it was only the beginning. The hours between takeoff and landing can stretch in strange ways. In first class, they seem to pass quickly, softened by wide seats, warm meals, and the quiet hum of conversation. In the back of the plane, time thickens. Every sound is sharper, every movement more noticeable. Adrian sat with his shoulders slightly angled to fit the narrow seat, the armrest pressing against his ribs. The scent of reheated food drifted from somewhere ahead, blending with the faint tang of the air system. The man on his left had slumped further in his sleep, his head tipping toward Adrian's shoulder. Adrian shifted just enough to avoid the contact, careful not to wake him. On his right, Miles had taken his notebook back out. The boy leaned against the window, sketching a wing that glowed faintly under the moonlight. Every few strokes he would glance outside, then return to the page with the focus of someone building a world of his own. Adrian studied the curve of the boy's brow, the steady movement of his pencil. He thought about the silent exchange they'd had before takeoff. It lingered with him, not because of the words, but because of the tone. There had been no surprise in Miles's comment about people making up reasons. It was too matter-of-fact for someone his age. That tone carried the weight of observation, the kind learned early. He tapped his phone awake, reading over what he had typed earlier. The words still felt raw, but they held the shape of something true. He added more, letting the memory of the walk down the aisle replay in his mind. He could still hear Trevor Hayes' voice, the self-satisfaction in each syllable. He could still see Melissa's back as she moved ahead of him, never once turning to see if he kept up. The scene replayed with such clarity that he felt again the shift in air pressure moving from one cabin to another, from space to confinement. He began to type descriptions of the seating, how 1A offered enough room for his knees to stretch without touching the seat in front, how the last row left no space to move without bumping someone else. He noted the smell of stale coffee in the rear galley, the sound of the lavatory door opening and closing. Details mattered. They grounded the account, made it tangible for anyone who would read it. A flight attendant passed, not Melissa, but another crew member with a polite but distant smile. She leaned in to offer drinks to the row in front of Adrian, then moved on without making eye contact. He wasn't thirsty. What he wanted couldn't be poured into a cup. Miles stopped sketching long enough to glance at Adrian's phone screen. "You're writing a lot," he said. Adrian lowered the phone slightly. "Just making notes." "About her?" Miles asked, tilting his head toward the front of the plane. "Yes," Adrian said simply. The boy didn't press further. He turned back to his drawing, but Adrian caught the way his shoulders eased. It was as if knowing someone else noticed had lifted a small weight from him. Adrian looked past the boy, out the window. The clouds below were illuminated by moonlight, a vast, shifting landscape. Somewhere far beneath, cities slept, unaware of what was unfolding 30,000 feet above. The idea struck him with sudden force. What had happened to him was invisible to almost everyone. Without his recording, without his notes, it would vanish the moment they landed. That invisibility was part of the problem. He typed another line. When prejudice is delivered with a smile or a clipped tone, it leaves no bruise, no photograph, but it leaves a mark. The seatbelt sign chimed on as the plane hit a patch of turbulence. Drinks rattled in cup holders, and the sleeping man on Adrian's left stirred, but didn't wake. Adrian kept one hand steady on his phone, the other gripping the armrest. Miles pressed his notebook flat against the tray table. Pencil paused until the shaking eased. Adrian's mind wandered briefly to his meeting in San Francisco. He would walk into that boardroom as the man they expected, prepared, composed, focused. No one there would know that 2 nights earlier, on the flight that brought him to them, he had been told he didn't belong in the very seat he had paid for. No one would imagine the walk from 1A to the last row, the stairs, the comments. And yet, those were the moments that stayed with a person long after business deals were signed. He thought of Rachel again. She would listen without interrupting when he told her. Her fingers laced around a coffee mug, her brow furrowing at certain points. She would ask what he planned to do, not whether he planned to do something. And she would remind him that moments like this weren't just about him. They were about everyone who would come after. The hum of the engines deepened as they leveled out. Adrian's eyes flicked to the cabin ahead. He could just see the curtain separating economy from premium. That thin piece of fabric carried more weight than it should have. It marked not just a change in service or comfort, but in perception. In the first-class cabin, passengers were being served plated meals and poured wine. Here, a cart of snacks and soda cans waited by the galley. He returned to his notes, this time writing not just about the incident, but about the pattern. How it wasn't the first time he'd been second-guessed, though never so publicly in a setting like this. How these moments always began the same way, with an assumption, followed by a refusal to verify facts. How, no matter his title or accomplishments, there were still spaces where others decided he did not belong. He added one more line before locking the screen. This flight is a symptom. The disease is older. Miles closed his notebook and slid it into his backpack. "Do you think we'll get there on time?" he asked. Adrian smiled faintly. "I think so. I hope so," the boy said. "My uncle's picking us up. He works at the airport." "That's good," Adrian replied. He wondered briefly what Miles's uncle would think if he knew what had happened before takeoff. The boy yawned, leaning back against the window. Within minutes, his breathing steadied, his pencil still in his hand. Adrian watched the rise and fall of his small chest, and something settled in him. The fight he was about to start wasn't only for himself. It was for that boy, for his uncle, for anyone who had ever been told to move without reason. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the rhythm of the engines fill his ears. But behind his eyelids, the words kept forming. The letter was taking shape. Soon, it would leave the confines of his notes and reach a place where Melissa Grant's clipped tone and Trevor Hayes' smug comment could not be ignored. When he opened his eyes again, the seatbelt sign was off. Passengers moved about the aisle, some heading to the lavatory, others stretching their legs. Adrian stayed where he was. He had work to do before this flight was over. Adrian balanced the phone in one hand and rested his other palm against the edge of the tray table. The hum of the engines was steady now, almost hypnotic, but his mind was sharper than it had been all day. The words had been collecting since Melissa first appeared at 1A. Now they demanded order. He began to write the letter not as an email, but as a statement. It was a habit he had learned in the early days of running Novosphere, when investors only took action if they saw a clear structure. He opened with the facts, the flight number, the departure time, the names he knew. He described his original seating assignment and the confirmation of his boarding pass. He laid out Melissa's refusal to acknowledge the pass and her insistence that he was not listed in first class. Then he shifted into what mattered most, the pattern. He wrote about how these moments were not isolated, how they reflected a deeper current that ran through corporate culture, customer service, and the small, unspoken hierarchies of public spaces. He wrote about being judged first by appearance, then by assumption, and finally by the unwillingness to check either against reality. He kept his tone calm, deliberate, and precise. It was not a complaint. It was a record. As he wrote, he was aware of the boy beside him shifting in his seat. Miles had woken up, rubbing his eyes before reaching for a small packet of pretzels from his backpack. He opened them quietly, careful not to spill crumbs on his drawing pad. "Are you writing a book?" Miles asked between bites. Adrian glanced over. "Something like that." "Does it have a bad guy?" the boy asked, his voice low as if the question itself might get him in trouble. Adrian considered that. "It has someone who made a bad choice," he said. Miles nodded, accepting the answer. "Does the good guy win?" "That depends on what you mean by win," Adrian said. The boy tilted his head, puzzled. Adrian smiled faintly and returned to his phone. He began the next section of the letter by explaining what a win would look like. It would not be an apology whispered in a corner after landing. It would not be a voucher or a free upgrade on a future flight. A win would be acknowledgement, transparency, and a change in policy to prevent other passengers from being displaced because of unfounded assumptions. He described the impact beyond himself, how such incidents shaped the experiences of children who witnessed them, teaching them early where they were and were not welcome, how it reminded adults of old wounds, the kind carried quietly through years of public life. His fingers moved steadily over the screen. The letter was becoming something that could live outside this moment, something that could reach far beyond this flight. A movement caught his eye. From the corner of his vision, he saw Trevor Hayes step through the curtain, separating first class from economy. He walked with a casual air, his hands in his pockets, scanning the rows as if looking for someone. Trevor's gaze landed on Adrian. A slow smirk spread across his face. He stopped just short of Adrian's row and leaned slightly toward him. "Comfortable back here?" Trevor asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Adrian kept his voice even. "More than I expected." Trevor chuckled softly. "Well, I hope you learned something about buying seats you can't keep." It was bait, pure and simple. Adrian could feel the pull of it, the temptation to respond in a way that would give Trevor exactly what he wanted. But instead, he tapped the phone screen, making sure the recording was still running. "I'm sure this conversation will be useful later," Adrian said quietly. Trevor's smirk faltered just enough to show he had registered the words. He gave a small shrug and turned back toward first class, slipping through the curtain without another glance. Miles looked at Adrian with wide eyes. Was that the bad guy Adrian allowed himself a quiet laugh? Something like that. He returned to his letter, adding a note about the encounter. He wrote that a fellow first-class passenger had approached him in economy to taunt him about being removed from his seat. He included Trevor's exact words, knowing that in print, they would reveal more about the culture of entitlement than any interpretation could. The plane was quiet now, except for the steady hum of the engines. Many passengers had dozed off, their faces softened in sleep. Flight attendants moved down the aisle with a cart, collecting empty cups and snack wrappers. Melissa did not come near his row. Adrian leaned back for a moment, letting his eyes close. Behind the darkness of his eyelids, he could see Rachel's face again. She would not be surprised by any of this. She would be measured in her reaction, not because she was indifferent, but because she understood the long game. She would remind him that the letter was not just a record, but a seed one that could grow into something larger if planted in the right place. When he opened his eyes, he reread what he had written. The words felt solid, anchored in truth, but they needed a closing, something that tied the incident to a broader call for accountability. He wrote, "I am not seeking compensation. I am seeking recognition that this was wrong. And I am demanding that Aerolux Airways put safeguards in place to ensure it does not happen again. If your airline claims to value its customers equally, that value must be reflected in every interaction, every cabin, and every seat." He added his full name, title, and contact information. He saved the document to both his phone and cloud storage, then emailed it to himself as a precaution. Miles leaned closer. "You finished your book for now?" Adrian said. The boy nodded thoughtfully. I think the good guy's going to win. Adrian smiled at that, not because he was certain of it, but because the boy's faith in the idea felt like a win in itself. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they were beginning their descent into San Francisco. Adrian powered down his phone and slid it into his briefcase. He could feel the shift in the plane's angle, the slight pressure in his ears as they descended through the night sky. He looked out the window past Miles. The city lights stretched out in clusters, the bay glimmering faintly beyond. Somewhere down there, in a few hours, his letter would begin its journey beyond his phone. He glanced toward the front of the plane one last time before landing. Melissa was moving through first class, smiling as she collected glasses and trays. Trevor Hayes was leaning back in his seat, eyes closed, as if nothing had happened. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. This was not over. The wheels touched down on the San Francisco runway with a firm thud. The cabin jolted slightly, and a few overhead bins rattled from the force. Adrian kept his gaze fixed on the city lights beyond the window. Each glow in the distance felt like a reminder that the quiet work of the past 3 hours was about to step into a louder world. The plane slowed, turning off the runway toward the terminal. Flight attendants prepared for arrival, voices clipped but polite as they reminded passengers to remain seated in first class. Adrian could see Trevor Hayes leaning toward Melissa, his lips moving in conversation. Melissa laughed at something he said, her head tilting just enough to show her approval. Miles sat up straighter beside Adrian, peering over the seat in front of him. "We're here," the boy said with a mix of relief and excitement. Adrian nodded. "Almost." As the aircraft rolled toward the gate, Adrian retrieved his briefcase from under the seat. He slid his phone into an inner pocket, its weight oddly comforting. He had protected the document like one guards a valuable item, but soon its safety would depend on sending it out into the world. The seatbelt sign pinged off. Passengers stood almost instantly, the soft rush of movement filling the cabin. Adrian remained seated for a moment longer, watching as people jostled for their bags from the overhead bins. The curtain to first class stayed closed until Melissa finally pulled it back. She gave a bright, almost exaggerated farewell to the passengers in front, her voice carrying just far enough to remind him she could turn charm on like a switch. When his rouse turn came, Adrian rose and retrieved his bag from the bin. Miles gave him a quick wave as he joined his family ahead. Adrian returned it with a faint smile before stepping into the aisle. As he reached the front of the plane, Melissa's smile dimmed. "Thank you for flying with us," she said, her tone flat now. Adrian met her gaze evenly. "I'm sure we'll speak again." She blinked but said nothing more. Stepping into the jet bridge, the cooler air met his face, carrying the faint metallic scent of the terminal. The corridor opened into the bustle of San Francisco International Airport passengers hurrying to connections, families greeting arrivals, voices blending into a constant background hum. Adrian's phone buzzed in his pocket. He stepped to the side of the walkway before answering. It was Rachel. "You landed, yes," he said. "You sound focused," she replied, her voice probing. "I finished it," he said simply. There was a pause. And I'm going to send it tonight." Rachel exhaled softly. "Adrian, you know once it's out there, you can't pull it back." "I'm counting on that," he said. She was quiet for a moment longer. "Then make sure you send it to the right hands first. I know exactly where it's going." They ended the call, and Adrian began walking toward baggage claim. His shoes clicked against the polished floor, echoing faintly in the high-ceilinged space. Near the carousel, he found a quiet corner and opened his phone. He reread the letter one last time. Every sentence still carried the weight he intended. He drafted a short email to accompany it, addressed to 3 people: Aerolux Airways Customer Relations Head, the General Counsel, and a journalist he trusted at the Chronicle. In the subject line, he wrote Incident Report, Flight 482 ATL SFO. He attached the letter, then added the audio file from his recording. The steady hum of the engines, the clipped tone of Melissa's voice, the smug inflection in Trevor Hayes' comment, all of it preserved. Before pressing send, he hesitated for the briefest moment. A small, cautious voice inside reminded him of the risk. Public fights could turn ugly. People could twist the story, question motives, drag private life into the spotlight. But another voice, quieter but far steadier, answered that silence was its own kind of loss. He pressed send. The email whooshed away, disappearing into the network. He felt no sudden release, no dramatic sense of triumph, just a calm certainty that something had shifted. By the time he reached his hotel in the city, it was nearly midnight. The room was high above Market Street, the lights of the city stretching toward the bay. He placed his briefcase on the desk, loosened his tie, and checked his phone again. 3 unread messages waited. The first was an automated response from Aerolux's customer service, promising to review his submission within 7 business days. The second was from the General Counsel's office, acknowledging receipt of his letter and assuring him it would be evaluated with seriousness. The third was from the journalist. Just 2 words, call me. Adrian dialed immediately. You're telling me this happened tonight? The reporter's voice was brisk, already sharpening. Yes, Adrian said. Flight 482 departure at 6:45 from Atlanta. I was removed from my assigned seat in first class without cause. You have proof. Audio? Adrian replied. There was a pause, then the sound of rapid typing. This could run tomorrow morning, the reporter said. But if I'm going to put this out there, I'll need your permission to use your name and title. Adrian looked out at the city lights. He had thought about this already. Use both. He said, Understood. I'll call you back in an hour. When he hung up, Adrian sat in the armchair by the window. Below, the city moved on as if nothing had changed. But in his mind, the first ripple was already spreading. He imagined Melissa checking her messages in the crew lounge after the flight, Trevor Hayes reading the Chronicle over his morning coffee, someone at Aerolux forwarding the article to the CEO. The idea didn't bring satisfaction exactly. It was something heavier, more deliberate. This was not revenge. It was exposure. His phone buzzed again. A text from Rachel. I trust you, he typed back. You'll see why. In the quiet of the hotel room, Adrian realized he wasn't thinking only of himself anymore. The boy with the sketch pad, the people whose names he didn't know, but whose stories matched his, they were all part of this now. The letter had left his hands, and soon it would not be his alone. Adrian woke to the faint vibration of his phone on the nightstand. The room was still dark, the only light coming from the city far below. He reached for the device, squinting against the glow of the screen. It was 5:14 3 notifications blinked at him. The first was from the Chronicle. The headline read, Black CEO removed from first-class seat without cause. Airline faces questions. His own name was in the subheading, alongside Novosphere Technologies. The second was a link from Rachel, no message attached. When he tapped it, the same article appeared, But this time, it had already been shared thousands of times on social media. A video thumbnail showed Melissa leaning toward him in the first-class cabin. Her voice caught mid-sentence. The third was from Miles's uncle. Adrian hesitated before opening it. "Mr. Cole, I think you should know your story's everywhere. Miles saw it on the news this morning. He said to tell you the good guy's winning." Adrian let out a slow breath. The storm had broken sooner than he expected. He padded over to the window, phone still in hand. Outside, the streets were quiet, but the world beyond was awake and moving. He scrolled through the Chronicle article, reading the quotes the reporter had chosen. His letter was printed almost in full, the audio file embedded halfway down. Readers could click and hear exactly what happened: the clipped tone of Melissa's refusal, the smug chuckle from Trevor Hayes. The comments section was already active. Some voices expressed outrage. Others shared similar stories, some from Aerolux, others from different airlines. And then there were the skeptics, asking for more proof, questioning his motives. By the time he made coffee in the small hotel machine, his email inbox had swelled with messages, journalists requesting interviews, advocacy groups offering support, strangers sharing their own experiences. At 6:02, Rachel called. "They're in damage control already," she said without preamble. "I saw a statement on Aerolux's official feed. They're calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding and promising a full internal review." Adrian sat on the edge of the bed. "That's the first move. Contain it. Soften it. Wait for the noise to die down." "Will you respond?" she asked. "Yes," he said, but not directly to them. He pulled up a blank document on his laptop. The tone would be measured again, but this time the audience was larger. He began with the truth that had sparked this, that no one should lose their rightful seat because of someone else's unfounded assumption. He wrote about the ripple effect, how small acts of exclusion multiplied into broader patterns of inequity. By the time he finished, it was nearly 8. He sent the piece to the same journalist at the Chronicle, who promised to run it as an op-ed by noon. His phone buzzed again. This time it was an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Cole, this is Amanda Reyes from Aerolux Corporate Relations. We'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss a resolution to this matter." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Your resolution should start with acknowledging the harm done. Not just to me, but to everyone who sees themselves in this incident." "I understand. But perhaps we could have that conversation in person," Amanda said smoothly. "Send me the time and place," Adrian replied, "and make sure your CEO is in the room." There was a pause. "I'll see what I can do," she said. By mid-morning, the op-ed was live. It traveled even faster than the original article, shared by public figures, activists, and professionals who saw in it something they had experienced but never spoken aloud. The comments shifted, more voices joined in support, the skepticism shrinking under the weight of shared testimony. In the afternoon, a friend from Washington called. "You're trending on the Hill," he said. "A few members are already talking about holding hearings on airline discrimination. You might get an invitation to testify." Adrian stared at the phone after the call ended. He had been prepared for Aerolux to reach out, for the media to cover it heavily, but not for it to escalate into a political conversation this quickly. That evening, Aerolux released a second statement. It was more carefully worded, expressing regret for the customer's experience and promising immediate steps to review first-class boarding procedures. Still no admission of wrongdoing, no mention of systemic bias, Rachel called again that night. They're trying to close it without opening the door to liability, she said. "I know," Adrian replied. "That's why the door needs to be kicked open." He stood at the hotel desk, the city lights shimmering beyond the glass. He thought of Miles again, of the way the boy had drawn the plane's wing in his sketch pad. "The good guy's gonna win," the boy had said. Winning, Adrian realized, wasn't just about forcing Aerolux to apologize. It was about changing the environment so the next child who boarded a plane would never have to watch someone like Melissa deny them a place they belonged. His email chimed with a new message from Amanda Reyes. The meeting was set for 2 days later at Aerolux headquarters. Victor Lang, the CEO, would be present. Adrian closed the laptop, the quiet in the room settling over him like a held breath. He knew the storm was only beginning. The glass facade of Aerolux headquarters reflected the sharp morning sun, its surface shimmering like an invitation and a warning all at once. Adrian stood on the sidewalk for a moment, coffee in hand, watching the revolving doors spin steadily as employees in suits flowed in and out. He had been in buildings like this countless times for business, but today the air felt heavier, more charged. Inside, the lobby gleamed with polished marble floors and high ceilings framed by steel beams. A receptionist with a practiced smile greeted him and asked for his ID. Adrian handed it over without a word. She typed something into her computer, her eyes flicking to the screen, then to him. "Mr. Cole, they're expecting you on the 27th floor," she said. An elevator whisked him upward, the mirrored walls reflecting a composed figure in a charcoal suit, tie knotted with precision, face unreadable. But inside, his thoughts were shifting like water under ice. He replayed the audio in his mind. Not the words themselves, but the tone, the casual dismissal, the smirk. The elevator doors opened to a quiet reception area. Amanda Reyes stood waiting, her smile polite but tight. "Mr. Cole," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming in. I'm sure it will be worth the trip," he replied. She led him down a short hallway into a boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. At the far end of the table sat Victor Lang, CEO of Aerolux Airways. He rose as Adrian entered, his suit tailored perfectly, silver hair combed back, expression measured. "Mr. Cole," Victor said, his voice deep. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Adrian took the seat opposite him. Amanda settled to the side, a tablet in front of her. "I read your letter," Victor began. "It was compelling." Adrian folded his hands on the table, compelling enough to act on Victor's lips curved slightly, though it was not quite a smile. "We want to understand exactly what happened before we make any public commitments." "You have the audio," Adrian said evenly. "You have the boarding records. And you have a statement from your own junior attendant, Lena Zhao, confirming I was assigned. Seat 1A. Amanda's fingers stilled on the tablet. Victor glanced at her, then back at Adrian. "We are reviewing those details," he said carefully. "While you review," Adrian replied, "thousands of your customers are watching. They're watching to see if you'll treat this as an isolated inconvenience or as evidence of something bigger." Victor leaned back slightly. "Something bigger?" "Bias," Adrian said, the word hanging between them. "In the assumptions made by your staff, in the way authority was exercised in that cabin, and in the way your first public statement avoided acknowledging it." The room was quiet for a beat. Outside the glass, a gull wheeled lazily in the air, its wings catching the light. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Cole, we are in the business of transporting millions of passengers every year. Mistakes happen. This wasn't a mistake, Adrian said. It was a decision. Amanda cleared her throat. Perhaps we could discuss potential resolutions. Compensation. Public acknowledgement. I'm not here for a settlement, Adrian cut in, his voice still calm but edged with steel. I'm here for policy change. And if you won't commit to that voluntarily, the court of public opinion will force you to. Victor's gaze hardened, but he kept his voice level. What exactly are you asking for? Mandatory anti-bias training for all staff? Transparent reporting of seat reassignment incidents by race and gender? And a public apology that names what happened for what it was. That's a tall order, Victor said. That's the minimum. Adrian replied. Victor's jaw shifted, a small movement betraying the tension under his composed exterior. Amanda's tablet lit up with a notification. She glanced at it, then at Victor, her expression flickering just briefly. Oh, what is it? He asked. It's a new leak, Amanda said slowly. A video from a passenger in first class. It's already on multiple platforms. Adrian said nothing, but inside, he felt the current shift. Victor tapped his fingers on the table. Play it. Amanda turned the screen toward him. The video showed Melissa standing by Adrian's seat in first class, voice audible over the low murmur of the cabin. Her tone was clipped, her words deliberate. Sir, you're not listed here. This seat is for first-class passengers. Then came the shot of Trevor Hayes leaning back, smirking and saying, Hope you enjoy the back. The angle was shaky, but the expressions were clear. Victor watched the whole thing without speaking. When it ended, he set the tablet down. That's not good, he said quietly. It's the truth, Adrian replied. For the first time, Victor's polished composure cracked, just slightly. He looked at Amanda. Draft a holding statement. We'll need to address this immediately. Adrian stood. Address it fully. Mr. Lang. Not with softened language. Not with careful avoidance. You can fix this in a way that strengthens your company, or you can let it erode from the inside. Victor remained seated, watching him. You know this isn't over, he said. I'm counting on it, Adrian replied. Amanda escorted him back to the elevator. As the doors closed, Adrian caught a final glimpse of Victor, still at the table, the tablet screen glowing in front of him on the ride down. Adrian exhaled slowly. The building seemed to hum around him, the vibration of a machine suddenly thrown off balance. Outside, the air felt different, sharper, as if the city itself had shifted just a fraction. By the time he reached the street, his phone was already buzzing again. A journalist was asking for comment on the leaked video. Adrian stepped into the sunlight and answered. By the time Adrian reached his hotel, the video had already begun its second life online. The Chronicle's version of the clip had been shared more than 100,000 times. Dozens of other outlets had embedded it in their own coverage, each headline sharper than the last. One network's morning anchor stood in front of a giant screen displaying the freeze frame of Melissa leaning over Adrian's seat. The anchor's voice carried just the right mix of outrage and gravitas. Another airline incident raises questions about bias in the skies, she said, before replaying the moment where Trevor Hayes smirked and delivered his parting comment. Adrian dropped his briefcase on the bed and sat in the armchair, phone in hand. His email inbox was already beyond keeping up with. Civil rights groups wanted to set up meetings. Airline unions were issuing statements. Even strangers from overseas were sending him stories of similar treatment. Rachel called, her voice brisk. It's everywhere. CNN, BBC, even Al Jazeera. You've hit the global cycle. I didn't hit it, Adrian said quietly. It was waiting for someone to pull the trigger. "They're scrambling," she said. "Airolux just canceled their afternoon press briefing. My guess is they're trying to draft something new before tonight." The television in the room shifted to a live segment. A former airline executive was giving his take. "This is not just a customer service issue. It's a brand survival issue," he said. "You cannot have visuals like this paired with that kind of audio and expect to keep the trust of your premium passengers." By late afternoon, the financial tremors began. Airolux stock slipped 3% in a single trading hour. Analysts on business channels speculated about longer-term damage, citing a noticeable spike in cancellation requests on travel booking platforms. Adrian scrolled through his social feed. The hashtag #TryingSeatForAll had emerged, trending alongside "Blanche flying while black." Some posts were thoughtful threads unpacking systemic discrimination in travel. Others were blunt, fueled by anger, demanding boycotts. One post stopped him cold. It was a short video of Miles in his living room, holding up a handmade sign that read, "Everyone deserves their seat." The boy smiled shyly at the camera before his uncle spoke from off-screen. He wanted to thank Mr. Cole for standing up. Adrian saved the video. That one, he thought, mattered more than the headlines. At 7 in the evening, his phone rang. The caller ID read, "Amanda Reyes." "Mr. Cole," she began, her voice tighter than before. "We're aware of the acceleration of this story. Victor would like to revisit our earlier conversation as soon as possible." "I'm listening," Adrian said. "We're prepared to issue a public apology," she continued, naming the incident and acknowledging bias as a factor. "Additionally, we will commit to immediate anti-bias training for our staff." "That's a start," Adrian said. Amanda hesitated. "We'd also like to invite you to participate in shaping the policy changes." Adrian could hear the calculation in her tone. This was no sudden moral awakening. It was the realization that survival meant cooperation. "I'll consider it," he replied. "But this isn't about attaching my name to your fix. It's about making sure the fix is real." "We understand," Amanda said. "Victor will call you personally in the morning." After the call ended, Adrian sat in the quiet room. He could feel the momentum shifting. But with every step forward came the risk of it turning into a PR spectacle, stripped of substance once the public's attention drifted. At 9, Rachel arrived at the hotel. She had flown in on the first available flight, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "You're holding steady," she said, after they embraced. "I'm trying," Adrian replied. She set her bag down and moved to the window. "They're going to try to make this look like a partnership. You have to decide how much you want to play into that." "I've been thinking about that," Adrian said. "If I help shape it, I can make sure it's not hollow. But I can't let them turn it into a photo op." They talked for over an hour, weighing options, anticipating tactics. Outside, the city hummed with its usual night rhythms, but inside the room, the conversation was deliberate, measured, each decision treated like a chess move. Close to midnight, Adrian's phone buzzed again. It was the journalist from the Chronicle. "I'm hearing from sources inside Airolux that there's another piece of footage," she said. "What kind of footage?" Adrian asked. "Security camera from the boarding gate. Shows you scanning your ticket, shows Melissa checking her tablet. Then she turns toward the first-class cabin, and you can see her hesitate before speaking to you." Adrian was silent for a moment, and my source says she made a comment to another attendant before she approached you. Something about not recognizing you and assuming you were in the wrong section. "Do you have the audio?" Adrian asked. "Not yet. But if it surfaces, This goes from bad optics to undeniable bias caught on official equipment. Adrian ended the call and leaned back in the chair. He could feel the storm building toward another peak. Tomorrow's meeting with Victor would no longer be just a discussion. It would be a negotiation under the weight of a crisis that was still growing. He looked over at Rachel. If that audio comes out, they won't just apologize. They'll have to rebuild their culture from the ground up. Good, she said simply. Adrian stood and crossed to the window. The lights of the city seemed to flicker with a restless energy, as if the story now had a life of its own. Somewhere out there, people were boarding planes, trusting the system to treat them fairly. Tomorrow, he thought, he might have the leverage to make that trust a little less fragile. Morning light spilled across the skyline as Adrian and Rachel approached Aerolux headquarters. The building looked the same as it had 2 days ago, all glass and steel and quiet authority. But the atmosphere outside had changed. A small group of reporters stood near the entrance, microphones ready, camera lights flashing on as they spotted him. "Mr. Cole, is Aerolux offering you a settlement?" one asked. "Are you going to sue?" another shouted. "Do you think Melissa Grant should be fired?" Adrian didn't break stride. Rachel walked beside him, her expression calm but alert, eyes scanning the crowd. Security ushered them inside. Before the questions could follow, Amanda Reyes was waiting in the same 27th floor reception area. But this time she looked different. The tight professionalism was still there, but there was something else, an edge of fatigue around her eyes. "Victor's ready for you," she said quickly. The boardroom was just as Adrian remembered, the same floor-to-ceiling windows and immaculate table, but the energy was heavier. Victor Lang sat at the head, a folder in front of him, and beside him was a man Adrian didn't recognize, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a navy suit that seemed built for intimidation. "This is Mark Ellison, our general counsel," Victor said. Adrian took his seat across from them. Rachel sat to his right, her legal pad already open. Victor began with a tone that was both formal and measured. "Mr. Cole, before we proceed, I want to acknowledge that the situation has evolved significantly since we last spoke." "That's one way to put it," Adrian replied. Victor nodded to Amanda, who tapped her tablet. The large screen on the wall lit up, showing a still image from the boarding gate security footage. "This is what surfaced late last night," Amanda said. The video began. It showed Adrian approaching the gate, scanning his boarding pass. Melissa Grant looked at her tablet, then leaned toward another flight attendant and said something. There was no audio on the screen, just the movements. Then Amanda tapped again, and a second version of the clip played this time with sound. The voices were faint but clear enough to understand. Melissa's voice. "I don't recognize him. Are you sure he's in first class?" The other attendant. "It says seat 1A right here." Melissa. "Well, let's just double-check before he gets too comfortable." The sound cut off, and the room was silent. Rachel's pen paused mid-note. Adrian let the quiet stretch before speaking. "That's your lead flight attendant making a decision based on nothing but her own assumption. That's not a misunderstanding. That's bias in action." Victor's jaw flexed. "We can't dispute what's on that recording." Mark Ellison leaned forward. "Mr. Cole, Aerolux is prepared to make a public statement today. It will include an admission that bias played a role in your removal from seat 1A, an apology addressed directly to you, and a commitment to comprehensive bias and sensitivity training across our entire staff, from gate agents to executives." "That's good," Adrian said slowly. "But it's not enough." Victor's brow lifted. What more are you looking for? Structural transparency, Adrian replied. I want Aerolux to publish quarterly reports on all seat reassignments and removals, broken down by race and gender, and make those reports public. And I want a permanent independent oversight committee to review bias-related complaints. Mark's expression tightened. That's an aggressive demand for a private company. Adrian met his gaze evenly. So is removing a paying customer from their rightful seat because of who they are. Victor glanced between them, the weight of the decision clear on his face. Outside, the city's hum seemed to press against the glass. You understand, Victor said slowly, that agreeing to this sets a precedent. Other airlines may not follow suit. They will, Adrian said, once they see customers choosing the airline that does. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Victor leaned back in his chair, exhaling. If we agree to your terms, will you agree to work with us on shaping these reforms? I will, Adrian said, but only if they're implemented in full, not watered down for optics. Victor nodded once, a small but decisive movement. Then we have an understanding. Rachel set down her pen. We'll want the commitments in writing before any joint announcements. Of course, Mark said. Amanda shifted in her seat. There's one more matter, she said. Melissa Grant, the footage is clear, and the public is demanding accountability. We can either terminate her employment or place her on unpaid leave pending review. Victor looked at Adrian. Do you want her fired? Adrian's eyes were steady. I want her to face the consequences of her actions. If you fire her without addressing the culture that made her comfortable making that decision, nothing changes. Start with accountability at the top. Then make sure she understands why what she did was wrong. Victor gave a short nod. We'll take that under advisement. The meeting wound down with an agreement to draft a joint statement for release that afternoon. As Adrian and Rachel stood to leave, Victor said, Mr. Cole, I hope this is the start of a better relationship between you and Aerolux. Adrian looked at him for a moment. It's not about my relationship with your airline, Mr. Lang. It's about your airline's relationship with everyone who steps onto your planes. In the elevator, Rachel exhaled, a mix of relief and tension still in her shoulders. You pushed them as far as they could go without breaking, she said. That's the point, Adrian replied. Sometimes you have to take it to the edge so they can see what's at stake. Back at street level, the reporters were still there, and this time, Adrian stopped. Cameras clicked and microphones angled toward him. We had a productive meeting, he said clearly. Aerolux has acknowledged bias played a role in my removal from my seat, and they've agreed to make significant reforms. This isn't about me. It's about making sure no passenger has to go through what I did, no matter who they are. The questions came fast, but Adrian didn't stay long. He and Rachel walked away, their steps steady, the noise of the crowd fading behind them. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew the real test was just beginning because public promises were easy to make. Keeping them was the hard part. By mid-afternoon, the joint statement was ready. Adrian sat in his hotel room with Rachel, both of them reviewing the final draft on her laptop. It was short but sharp. Every sentence weighed like a legal argument. Aerolux Airways acknowledges that bias played a role in the reassignment of Mr. Adrian Cole's seat on Flight 482 from Chicago to New York. We apologize directly to Mr. Cole and commit to implementing comprehensive bias and sensitivity training for all staff. We will also publish quarterly public reports on seat reassignments and removals, and establish an independent oversight committee to review all bias-related complaints. Rachel looked at Adrian over the top of the screen. It's stronger than I expected from them. It's what they had to do, Adrian replied. The footage forced their hand. Without it, they'd still be calling it a misunderstanding. At 3 o'clock, the statement went live across Aerolux's official channels. Within minutes, news outlets began running the story. The image of Adrian boarding the plane was paired with the words "bias acknowledged" in bold letters. Cable news anchors dissected every detail. Analysts debated the implications, and social media lit up with reactions. Some applauded the move, calling it a model for corporate accountability. Others saw it as a calculated PR maneuver. Activists used the moment to highlight other incidents, tagging "Pawnee Seat for All" in each post. By evening, Adrian's phone was buzzing nonstop again. Former colleagues, strangers, even airline employees reached out. One email caught his attention, a message from a flight attendant at a competing airline. "Mr. Cole, I just want to say thank you. What you did has already started conversations in our company that I never thought would happen. I hope you know you're making a difference." He read it twice before forwarding it to Rachel. She smiled faintly. "That's the kind of message you save for the hard days." But the praise was only one side of the response. Aerolux's headquarters was surrounded by cameras, and their customer service lines were flooded with calls from angry passengers who shared their own experiences. Lawsuits began to surface, filed by customers claiming discriminatory treatment on past flights. The Department of Transportation announced that they were reviewing recent events at Aerolux as part of a broader investigation into bias in the airline industry. Rachel glanced at the television, where a live panel was debating the fallout. "They're not just dealing with your case anymore. This has opened a door they can't close." Adrian nodded slowly. "Good. Maybe it should stay open." The next morning, Adrian was invited to appear on a major morning show. He and Rachel debated whether to accept. "You can control your words," she said, "but not how they frame them." "I know," Adrian said, "but I think it's time the audience sees the full picture, not just a clip of me standing in the aisle." The studio was buzzing when they arrived. Bright lights, quick handshakes, the hum of cameras adjusting focus. Adrian sat across from the host, a man known for mixing charm with pointed questions. "Mr. Cole," the host began, "yesterday Aerolux publicly admitted bias in your case and agreed to sweeping changes. Some people say you've already won." "Why not walk away now?" Adrian met his gaze. "Because this isn't about me winning. It's about whether those changes last longer than the headlines. If the culture doesn't shift, this will happen again, to someone else." The host leaned forward. "Are you saying you don't trust Aerolux to follow through?" "I'm saying trust is earned," Adrian replied. "Right now. They've made a promise. I'll believe it when I see it." The segment ended with polite applause from the studio audience. As Adrian stepped off the set, a young production assistant stopped him. "My mom's a flight attendant," she said softly. "She told me about things she's seen but couldn't speak up about. What you're doing matters." Later that day, Aerolux's Independent Oversight Committee was officially announced. The list of members included former judges, civil rights advocates, and a retired airline captain known for his outspoken stance on passenger rights. Adrian read the press release and recognized some names. He knew a few would hold the company accountable if given the chance. But behind the progress, the backlash against Melissa Grant was intensifying. News crews had camped outside her apartment building. Online forums were dissecting her career history. Adrian felt a complicated knot in his chest about it. She had acted on bias. Yes. But turning her into a public villain wouldn't fix the deeper problem. That evening, as he and Rachel walked through the quiet streets near their hotel, She asked the question he had been avoiding. "Do you want to reach out to her?" Adrian slowed his pace. "Part of me does, but not yet. Not while this storm is still raging. Maybe later, when the cameras are gone," Rachel said. He nodded. "When it's not about headlines, maybe then." By the end of the week, Aerolux had already started its first wave of staff training. Photos circulated online showing uniformed crew members in conference rooms with diversity trainers at the front. Some people were skeptical, calling it performative. Others saw it as a step in the right direction. Adrian stayed out of the daily noise, focusing instead on the Oversight Committee's charter. He sent them a detailed set of recommendations, practical steps for data collection, reporting, and passenger complaint handling. If Aerolux truly wanted to set a precedent, they had to do more than issue an apology. They had to build systems that would make it harder for bias to go unchecked. One night, scrolling through his phone before bed, Adrian saw that Miles Bennett's video had passed 1 million views. The boy's simple sign, "Everyone deserves their seat," had been turned into T-shirts and posters. Some schools were using it in classroom discussions about fairness and respect. Rachel saw the smile on his face. "That's your real victory," she said. "Maybe," Adrian replied. "But I think the real victory will be when a kid like him never has to make that sign in the first place." As the city lights shimmered outside their hotel window, Adrian knew the battle wasn't over. But for the first time since he stood in the aisle of that plane, he felt something steady in his chest, not just resolve, but hope. The invitation came 3 days after Aerolux's statement. It was printed on heavy cream paper, the kind that carried both formality and weight. The United States Senate Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure requests your testimony in an upcoming hearing on equity and anti-discrimination measures in the airline industry. Rachel read it over his shoulder. "This is bigger than Aerolux now," she said. Adrian set the letter down. "That's what worries me. Bigger means politics. And politics means everyone has their own agenda." The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday in Washington, D.C. By the time Adrian arrived at the Senate office building, the media had already gathered outside. Reporters called his name as he climbed the marble steps. Rachel walked beside him, her legal pad in hand, ready for whatever questions might come. Inside, the hearing room was buzzing. Senators milled around. Aides whispered in corners. Photographers adjusted their lenses. The long dais curved in a semicircle at the front, with nameplates for each committee member. When the session began, Senator Eleanor Pratt, the chair, called the room to order. She was a sharp-eyed woman from California, known for her work on civil rights legislation. "Today," she began, "we address an issue that should not exist in the 21st century bias in air travel. Our witness is Mr. Adrian Cole, CEO of Novosphere Technologies, whose recent experience with Aerolux Airways has brought national attention to this matter." Adrian adjusted the microphone. "Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Adrian Cole. 2 weeks ago, I boarded Flight 482 from Chicago to New York. I had a confirmed ticket for Seat 1A in first class. I was removed from that seat not because of a mistake in the manifest, not because of an operational issue, but because the lead flight attendant assumed I did not belong there." He paused, letting the words settle in the room. "I have the resources and visibility to challenge what happened. Most people do not. That is why I am here. This is not just about me. It is about ensuring that air travel is free from the kind of bias that strips people of their dignity before the wheels even leave the ground." Senator Pratt nodded. "Mr. Cole, Can you tell us what reforms Aerolux has agreed to Adrian outline the quarterly public reports, the independent oversight committee, and the mandatory training? These are important steps, he said, but without accountability beyond the company itself, change can erode over time. Senator Howard Briggs from Texas leaned forward. Are you suggesting federal oversight? I am suggesting transparency, Adrian replied. Airlines should be required to report data on passenger removals, reassignments, and complaints related to bias. If that data is public, it becomes harder to hide patterns. Some senators scribbled notes. Others glanced at each other. Senator Briggs pressed further. Do you believe bias in air travel is systemic? Yes, Adrian said without hesitation. Because bias is not about isolated incidents. It's about patterns of behavior that repeat until they are confronted. As the questioning continued, Adrian navigated pointed challenges and genuine curiosity. Senator Pratt asked about passenger complaint procedures. Senator Alvarez from New York pressed him on whether independent oversight committees should be mandated by law. The most heated exchange came when Senator Briggs suggested that training might be enough. Adrian kept his voice calm. Senator, training addresses awareness. Accountability addresses behavior. Without both, the problem persists. Midway through the hearing, an aide passed a note to Senator Pratt. She read it quickly, then leaned into her microphone. Mr. Cole, you should know that the Department of Transportation has just announced an industry-wide review of bias-related complaints over the last 5 years. They are citing your case as one of the catalysts. There was a stir in the room. Adrian glanced at Rachel. Her eyes told him what he was thinking. The ripple effect had begun. In his closing statement, Adrian said, I am not here to punish airlines. I am here to push for a standard that protects passengers and rebuilds trust. Air travel connects the world, but connection means nothing if the journey begins with exclusion. When the gavel struck to adjourn, reporters surged forward. Adrian and Rachel made their way through the crowd, answering a few questions before slipping out a side exit. Outside, the cold D.C. air hit them. Rachel pulled her coat tighter. You just shifted the conversation from one company to an entire industry, she said. Adrian exhaled. Now we see if the people in that room actually meant what they said. Back at the hotel, his phone buzzed with messages. Some were from friends congratulating him. Others were from people he had never met, sharing their own stories of being singled out while traveling. One message stood out. I watched your testimony with my daughter. It read, She asked me why anyone would think you didn't belong in that seat. I didn't know how to answer her. Thank you for making her see that the problem isn't her, it's the system. That night, Adrian stood by the window, looking down at the lights of the Capitol. He knew the attention would fade eventually. The headlines would give way to the next crisis. The question was whether the structures he had helped set in motion would last beyond the moment. Rachel joined him, resting her hand on his arm. You did good today, she said softly. I hope so, Adrian replied, because I don't want to be back here in 5 years telling the same story. The first thing Adrian noticed when the cab pulled into his driveway was the quiet. After days of airports, cameras, and the hum of city streets, the stillness of home felt almost foreign. Rachel paid the driver while Adrian grabbed their bags. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine from the trees lining the yard. He stood for a moment at the front steps, letting it sink in that the whirlwind of the last 2 weeks had brought him back here. Inside, the familiar warmth wrapped around him. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and old books. Their dog, Jasper, padded over and pressed against his leg. Rachel smiled. "He's been waiting for you." Adrian knelt, scratching Jasper behind the ears. "I missed you too, buddy." That night they ate dinner at the kitchen table. Just the two of them. No phones, no television. For the first time in days, they spoke about ordinary things: a neighbor's new fence, the state of the garden, an old friend's wedding invitation. But under it all was the unspoken weight of what they had just been through. When the dishes were done, Adrian went to his study. The room was dim except for the glow of his desk lamp. On the desk sat a small stack of unopened letters and a box that had arrived while they were away. He opened the first envelope. It was a handwritten note on lined paper. "Mr. Cole, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I saw your story on the news. My father was taken off a plane last year for no reason, and we never got an apology. Seeing you speak made me feel like someone finally said what we couldn't." He set it aside and opened another, and another. Each letter carried its own story, some angry, some hopeful, some simply thankful. Finally, he turned to the box. Inside was a folded white T-shirt. Across the chest, in bold black letters, were the words, "Everyone deserves their seat." There was a note tucked under it. It was from Miles Bennett's mother. "Dear Mr. Cole, Miles wanted you to have this. He said you gave him courage when you stood your ground, and he hopes you'll wear it someday when you need a reminder the people are behind you. He's been talking about becoming a pilot now. He says he wants to be the kind of captain who makes sure no one is treated the way you were." Adrian sat back in his chair, the shirt in his hands. The fabric was soft, but it carried more weight than any garment he had ever owned. The next morning, Adrian took a walk through the neighborhood. People waved from porches, some stopping to shake his hand. A few mentioned the hearing. One older man simply said, "Proud of you," and kept walking. When he returned home, Rachel was on the porch with a tablet in her lap. "You should see this," she said. It was a news clip from the airport where the original flight had taken place. A different airline, a different crew. A black woman with a boarding pass for first class had been stopped by a gate agent. Another passenger had filmed it, but before it could escalate, a senior attendant stepped in, looked at her ticket, and said, "Ma'am, right this way. Welcome aboard." The caption beneath the video read, "New bias training in action." The attendant later confirmed in an interview that the training had been implemented in direct response to the Aerolux reforms and that other airlines had quietly adopted similar measures. Adrian felt a slow, steady pride settle in his chest. The change was already moving beyond Aerolux, rippling out into places he might never see. That afternoon, he sat at his desk to write. Not another letter to an airline, but a message to the Oversight Committee, urging them to track these early wins and use them to build momentum. He knew there would be setbacks. There always were. But this was proof that a single act of resistance could echo far beyond the moment. That evening, Rachel joined him in the study. "You've been quiet all day," she said. "I've been thinking about something Senator Pratt said." Adrian replied, "That air travel connects the world." "She's right. But connection isn't just about getting from one place to another. It's about how you're treated in the space between." Rachel nodded. "And you made that space a little better." They sat in silence for a moment, the soft hum of the lamp filling the room. Adrian thought of the boy in economy, of the people who had written to him, of the quiet changes already taking place. Before bed, he took the T-shirt Miles had sent and hung it on the back of his study chair. It would stay there, a reminder that the fight wasn't over, but also that it could be won. The next morning, he booked a flight. Not first class, not even business, just a standard seat in economy. When Rachel raised an eyebrow, he said, "I want to see for myself if the air feels any different." A week later, boarding a plane again, he felt the familiar scent of jet fuel, the shuffle of passengers finding their seats. The attendant at the door greeted him warmly, checking his ticket without hesitation. No second look, no pause. As he moved down the aisle, he noticed a young man in a crisp uniform, a junior flight attendant, helping an elderly couple with their bags. He glanced up, saw Adrian, and smiled. "Welcome aboard, sir," he said. It was an ordinary greeting, but Adrian felt something shift inside him. Sometimes change didn't announce itself with headlines. Sometimes it was in the small moments, the quiet respect that should have been there all along. He settled into his seat, looked out the window as the plane began to taxi. Somewhere up ahead, the runway stretched toward a horizon he couldn't quite see, but he knew it was there. And for the first time in a long time, he believed the journey ahead might just be worth the flight. When Adrian Cole boarded that plane, he carried only his luggage and his ticket. He never imagined he would also carry the weight of a movement. In just days, his quiet stand forced an airline to admit bias, reform its policies, and spark conversations across the industry. But beyond the headlines, it reminded the world of something simple and profound. That respect is not a privilege. It is a right. Because every time a seat is denied based on prejudice, it's not just a passenger who is moved. It's the moral compass of an entire system that shifts the wrong way. Adrian's journey showed us that one person's refusal to accept injustice can open the door for thousands more to walk through. And yet, the fight isn't over. For every story we hear, there are countless others we don't. So the next time you see someone being treated unfairly, will you look away or will you speak up? If this story moved you, let it keep moving. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us what justice looks like in action.